The old grandfather clock in the hall wasn't just a timepiece, it was a witness. For years, Clara Turner, a slave on the Abernathy plantation, was the only one who touched it, her hands polishing the dark wood until it shone even in the dim candlelight. But on a night in 1842, as a storm raged outside, the clock did something impossible. It struck 13 times. By morning, the storm had passed, but Clara was gone, vanished without a trace. The only clue was the clock itself, its hands mysteriously pointing backward. They said she ran, they said she was taken, but the truth was far stranger than anyone could imagine. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The air over the Abernathy plantation in the summer of 1842 was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket woven from heat, humidity, and the silent, simmering dread that clung to everything. It was an atmosphere you could taste, the cloying sweetness of magnolia blossoms mingling with the salt of sweat and the metallic tang of fear. From the grand columned porch of the main house, the cotton fields stretched out to a hazy horizon, the green leaves and white bowls shimmering under a sun that bleached the very color from the sky. The drone of cicadas was a constant sawing thrum, a sound so relentless it felt like the auditory expression of the oppressive stillness. The plantation house itself was a monument to a decaying grandeur. Its white paint was beginning to peel, revealing the weathered gray wood beneath, and a faint scent of mildew clung to the opulent draperies within. This facade of decaying elegance stood in stark, brutal contrast to the slave quarters, a row of stark, cramped cabins huddled together as if for protection, their wood silvered by sun and rain, their interiors holding the dense human smell of too many people living in too small a space. In this world of stark divisions, Clara Turner moved with a quiet grace that was its own form of defiance. She was a woman in her late 20s, though the hardships of her life had etched a maturity into her features that made her seem older. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, were her most striking feature. They were watchful, missing nothing yet revealing little. While most of her days were spent in the relentless labor of the house, her true domain, the one place where she held an unspoken authority, was the main hall. There stood the master's most prized possession, a towering grandfather clock, its mahogany case glowing with a deep, ruddy fire. Master Abernathy's father had brought it all the way from London, a monstrous, beautiful thing of polished wood and gleaming brass. It was Clara's duty to care for it, and she did so with a reverence that both mystified the other slaves and unsettled her masters. Her touch on the wood was not that of a servant performing a task, but of a devotee tending a shrine. It was her one sanctum in a life that was not her own. Her masters, of course, saw only what they wanted to see. Master Abernathy was a man whose inherent cruelty was poorly masked by a thin veneer of southern gentility. He spoke with a soft drawl, but his eyes were hard, and his temper could flare with the sudden, violent intensity of a lightning strike. He demanded order, and the clock was his ultimate symbol of it, its steady, rhythmic ticking a confirmation of his control over his world. His wife, Eleanor Abernathy, was a woman perpetually adrift in a sea of anxiety. Her hands fluttered like trapped birds, and her gaze was sharp and suspicious, forever searching for signs of insolence or rebellion. She watched Clara with a particular intensity, mistaking the woman's quiet dignity for a deep, simmering arrogance. One sweltering afternoon, as Clara polished the clock's glass face, Eleanor's unease bubbled to the surface. "That girl pays more mind to that clock than to her chores," she murmured to her husband, fanning her flushed face with a palmetto fan. "It's unnatural." Master Abernathy glanced over, his eyes lingering on the steady, methodical movement of Clara's hands. "As long as it keeps perfect time, she can worship it for all I care," he replied, his voice dismissive. "My father brought that clock from London. It's a symbol of order, As dusk began to bleed across the sky that evening, it brought with it a change in the atmosphere. The oppressive heat did not lessen, but it was joined by a strange electric tension. The sky to the west bruised, turning a sickly shade of purple and green. A violent thunderstorm was rolling in, and the power of it felt elemental, almost personal. The wind began to rise, first as a whisper through the cotton leaves, then as a mournful howl that rattled the window panes of the great house. As the first drops of rain, fat and heavy, began to fall, Clara went about her final duty of the night, winding the grandfather clock. This was a private, almost ritualistic moment for her. The other house slaves had retreated, and the Abernathys had retired to their upstairs parlor, leaving her alone in the cavernous hall. She retrieved the cold, heavy brass key from its hook inside the clock's waist. The feel of it in her palm was familiar, a solid, tangible piece of a puzzle only she understood. She inserted it into the winding hole, and the rhythmic turning began. Each soft click of the mechanism a measured beat in the growing symphony of the storm. Her face, illuminated by a single flickering candle, was a mask of calm, but her eyes held a deep, determined focus. She was listening, not just to the clock's inner workings, but to the voice of the storm itself. In the quiet solitude of that moment, Clara's thoughts were her own. Her mind was a repository of knowledge that the Abernathys could never comprehend, a rich tapestry of folklore, herbal wisdom, and the intricate spiritual practices known as root work, passed down from her mother and her mother's mother before her. She saw the storm not as a threat, but as an ally, a source of immense, untamed power. She thought of the old stories, the whispers of backwards doors and stolen moments, tales of those who had learned to slip through the cracks of time, to find a freedom not of place but of existence. This was not just the winding of a clock, it was a preparation. For weeks she had watched the sky, read the signs in the behavior of birds and insects, and felt the coming confluence of energies in her very bones. The storm was the final piece, the catalyst. The air grew thick with foreboding. In their quarters, the other slaves huddled together, their prayers and fearful whispers lost in the rising crescendo of the wind and rain. In the main house, the Abernathys were on edge, the storm's fury mirroring the unspoken turmoil of their own lives. The clock began to strike midnight. The chimes were deep and resonant, each note vibrating through the floorboards and into the very bones of the house. 1, 2, 3. The sound was a familiar anchor in the chaos of the storm. 4, 5, 6. The chimes marked the relentless linear progression of the master's time. 7, 8, 9. Clara stood motionless before it, her eyes fixed on the clock face, her breathing slow and even. 10, 11, 12. A pause followed the final chime, a moment of profound silence where the storm outside seemed to hold its breath. And then it came. A 13th chime. It was utterly impossible, a sound that had no place in the ordered mechanical world of the clock. It was different from the others, not a resonant boom, but a sharp, crystalline crack, like the sound of ice breaking on a winter river, or a fissure opening in the very fabric of the night. The note hung in the air, impossibly long, vibrating with an energy that made the candle flame dance and the hairs on one's arms stand on end. In their upstairs bedroom, the Abernathys sat bolt upright in their bed. "What in God's name was that?" Master Abernathy snarled, his face a mask of fury. He thought the precious clock was broken, a final act of insolence from the storm or a careless servant. Eleanor, however, was terrified. She clutched the cross at her neck, her eyes wide with a primal fear. "It was the devil's chime," she whispered, her voice trembling. In the slave quarters, the sound had cut through their fear, replacing it with a stunned, awestruck terror. They looked at each other with wide, questioning eyes. They had lived their entire lives by the sound of that clock, and it had never ever done that before. The focus returned to the great hall. The 13th chime finally faded, its echo absorbed by the heavy velvet curtains and the dark wood. The storm outside, as if its purpose had been served, began to recede, its fury softening to a steady rhythmic drumming of rain. The camera of the mind pans to the clock, its brass pendulum still, its face inscrutable in the flickering candlelight. Then it moves to the space where Clara had been standing. The space was empty. She was gone. There was no sound of a struggle. No overturned furniture, no sign of a hasty departure. There was only an empty space on the polished floorboards, the faint scent of beeswax and ozone lingering in the air. Dawn broke clear and cool, the air washed clean by the storm. The world outside was pristine, glistening, and deceptively peaceful. Inside the Abernathy house, however, a new storm was brewing. A house slave sent to wake Clara found her pallet in the quarters empty and unslept in. The alarm was raised. Master Abernathy, his face mottled with rage, stormed down the grand staircase, convinced that Clara had finally done what he had always suspected she might. She had run. He saw the 13th chime as a final mocking act of defiance, a deliberate breaking of his most prized possession before she fled. He burst into the great hall, his voice bellowing her name, expecting to find evidence of her flight, a door left ajar, a window unlatched. But the hall was still and empty, exactly as it had been left the night before. All the doors were bolted from the inside. All the windows were secure. There was no way out. His furious gaze fell upon the grandfather clock. He strode toward it, ready to wrench open its case and inspect the damage. But he stopped dead, his breath catching in his throat. The clock was silent. Its pendulum was still, and its long, elegant hands, which should have been pointing to the early morning hour, were frozen. They were pointing backward to the hour of 11. The mystery had begun. The morning after the storm was a scene of controlled chaos, a frantic human counterpoint to the serene, glistening landscape. An enraged Master Abernathy, his face a mask of thunderous fury, organized a search party with a brutal efficiency born of pure indignation. He was convinced Clara had fled, that the impossible chime and the frozen clock were a final calculated act of defiance designed to mock him and the unshakable order of his world. The overseers, their faces grim and their movements sharp, gathered the strongest men and the lean, hungry-looking tracking dogs, whose excited yelps quickly subsided into an unnerving, confused silence. They fanned out from the main house, a grim procession moving into the rain-washed woods, the air cool and clean, smelling of damp earth and crushed pine needles. Every leaf on every tree dripped with crystal droplets of water, and the ground, though soft, should have been a perfect canvas for footprints, a clear testament to a desperate flight. Yet, there were none. The dogs, animals bred and trained for the singular purpose of tracking human despair, were the first sign that something was profoundly wrong. They whined and circled, their noses twitching at the air as if tasting a scent that was both there and not there, a phantom presence that offered no trail. They were led to the slave quarters, to Clara's empty pallet, and they sniffed at the worn blanket, their intelligent eyes looking up at their handlers with a bewildered expression. It was as if they were being asked to track a ghost, a column of smoke, a memory. They found nothing leading away from the cabin, nothing near the main house, nothing at the edge of the woods where the shadows lay deep and cool. It was as if Clara Turner had been plucked from the earth by an invisible hand, leaving not so much as a single broken twig or a displaced stone to mark her passage from this world into another. The search continued all day, a futile, sweeping exercise in mounting frustration. The men crashed through the undergrowth, their shouts for Clara echoing in the unnaturally quiet woods, the sounds swallowed by the damp, heavy leaves. They searched the banks of the creek, its waters running high and brown from the storm, and the dense thickets of blackberry bushes, their thorns tearing at clothes and skin. They peered into the shadowy hollows between the ancient oaks, places where a person could easily hide, but they found only stillness. As the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows that looked like grasping fingers across the fields, the lead overseer approached Master Abernathy on the porch. His hat held nervously in his hands. His face was slick with sweat and etched with a deep, unsettling confusion that bordered on fear. "It's queer, sir," he said, his voice low, avoiding his master's burning gaze. "The dogs can't find a thing. We've covered every inch of this ground from the creek to the county line. It's like she was never there." Abernathy's face, which had been flushed with rage, seemed to pale. His fury was so immense it had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, terrifying void of disbelief. He stared out at the darkening woods, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides, his mind a maelstrom of denial. Slaves ran, they were caught, they were punished. That was the order of things. They did not simply dissolve into thin air. "Find her," he commanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl that was more menacing than any shout. "I don't care if you have to tear this whole county apart. No slave of mine simply vanishes." The failure of the physical search turned Abernathy's rage inward, souring it into a venomous suspicion that he directed at the people he owned. The next day, he began the interrogations. He had the house slaves brought to the main porch one by one, while the field hands were questioned in the stark, intimidating space of the cotton gin, the massive, silent machine a looming threat in the background. He used every tool at his disposal, his voice shifting from a false, honeyed promise of reward to a sharp, cutting threat of punishment. He watched their faces, his eyes like chips of flint, searching for a flicker of knowledge, a hint of conspiracy, the slightest crack in their composure. But he found only a wall of terrified, guarded ignorance. They were afraid, their eyes wide and their bodies trembling under his scrutiny, but their answers were maddeningly, perfectly uniform. They spoke of Clara's quietness, her strange devotion to the clock, and the bone-deep fear the 13th chime had struck in them. They knew nothing. They saw nothing. Their fear of him was a tangible thing, a scent in the air, but their fear of whatever had happened that night, of the power that had taken Clara, was clearly greater. It was a deeper, more primal terror that sealed their lips more effectively than any threat he could make. Finally, in a last desperate attempt, he sent for Sarah. She was a small girl, barely 10 years old, with wide, solemn eyes and braids so tight they pulled at the corners of her scalp, giving her a look of perpetual surprise. Clara had taken a special interest in her, teaching her not just to mend clothes, but to read the clouds and identify the useful herbs that grew in the shadow of the woods. She was brought before him on the grand porch, her small, bare feet looking lost on the vast, polished floorboards that Clara herself had so meticulously cared for. She stood trembling, her hands clasped tightly behind her back, a tiny figure dwarfed by the looming columns of the house. Abernathy, in a calculated shift of tactics, softened his voice, attempting a grandfatherly tone that sounded grotesque and predatory coming from his lips. "Sarah," he began, leaning forward in his rocking chair, "I know Clara was your friend, a good friend. She must have told you something, a secret perhaps. Did she speak of running away? Of going north to the Free States?" Sarah kept her eyes fixed on a knot in the wooden floor, her small world reduced to that single swirling point of focus. She was terrified, but beneath the fear was a core of resolve, a secret she was determined to keep locked away in her heart, a final gift from the woman who had shown her kindness. "What did she tell you, girl?" Abernathy's voice sharpened, the thin veneer of patience cracking to reveal the raw anger beneath. "Where did she go?" The girl looked up then, her gaze meeting his for a brief, startling moment. In her dark eyes he saw not just fear but a flicker of something else, something ancient and knowing. A whisper of a voice so quiet he had to lean in to hear it emerged from her. "She said some doors don't lead to another room," Sarah trembled, reciting the words as if they were a sacred prayer she had memorized long ago. "Some lead to another time. She said you just have to know when to knock." Abernathy stared at her for a long moment, his mind struggling to process the bizarre, nonsensical words. Then he threw his head back and let out a short, harsh laugh, a sound devoid of any humor. It was childish nonsense, a fairy tale the woman had filled the girl's head with to confuse her. He dismissed her with an angry wave of his hand, his frustration curdling into a bitter, impotent rage. The girl's words were meaningless, a fool's riddle, yet they echoed in his mind as he sat alone on his porch that evening, another piece of the maddening, unsolvable puzzle that Clara had left in her wake. A year passed. Life on the Abernathy plantation continued its brutal, monotonous rhythm. But the undercurrent had changed forever. The story of Clara's disappearance had seeped into the very soil of the place, a new and potent myth that was whispered in the quarters at night, a secret spring of wonder in a desert of hardship. The empty space she left behind was filled with stories, with speculation, with a growing sense of awe. The clock, which Master Abernathy had summoned a specialist all the way from Savannah to fix, was a source of constant obsessive attention for him. The clockmaker, a prim man with spectacles and a deep understanding of mechanics, had spent 2 days taking the device apart and putting it back together, only to declare that there was nothing mechanically wrong with it. This pronouncement, meant to be reassuring, only deepened Abernathy's paranoia. He had it reset, and its familiar, steady ticking once again filled the hall, a sound he now found more menacing than reassuring. Each tick a countdown to a mystery he could not solve. Then came the anniversary. As dusk fell on that fated night a year later, a small, restless storm rolled in, a pale, spectral echo of the tempest from the year before. A sense of anticipation, thick and palpable, settled over the plantation. In the slave quarters, people gathered quietly in doorways and huddled in small groups, their eyes turned toward the distant lights of the main house, their faces expectant. Inside, Master Abernathy sat by the fire in his study, a glass of bourbon in his hand, the amber liquid catching the firelight. He was determined to prove it had all been a fluke, a freak occurrence caused by the lightning strike. He would sit and listen to the clock strike its 12 orderly chimes, and the ghost of Clara Turner, the ghost of his own failure, would be laid to rest for good. The clock began to strike midnight. He counted along with each deep, resonant chime, his knuckles white on his glass. 10, 11, 12. A pause. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, and a slow, triumphant smile began to spread across Abernathy's face. It was over. It was just a clock. And then it came, the 13th chime. It rang out through the house, clear, defiant, and utterly unmistakable, a note of pure, crystalline impossibility. For Abernathy, the sound was a physical blow, a torment that shattered his composure and confirmed his deepest fears. He was not in control. He was being haunted, not by a spirit, but by his own powerlessness. He hurled his glass into the fireplace, where it shattered with a sharp crack that was lost in the lingering vibration of the chime. But in the quarters, the sound was received not with fear, but with a collective hushed gasp of wonder and joy. It was a message. It was a promise. The legend of 13 Chime Clara was born that night. It was a story told in whispers, a folk tale that grew with each telling, embellished with the hopes and dreams of a people starved for them. They said Clara hadn't run to the north, a place they could only imagine, but had escaped time itself, outsmarting her master in a way he could never comprehend. The clock was her signal, her yearly promise that a different kind of freedom was possible. The story began to travel, a secret currency of hope carried by word of mouth from one plantation to the next. It became a coded message of resistance, a testament to a woman who had used not violence or flight but intelligence, spirit, and a profound, hidden magic to break her chains. The 13th chime was not a curse on the house but a beacon of hope for all who heard it. A reminder that even in the most rigid and brutal of worlds there were cracks through which the light and the spirit could escape. The decades that followed the war were a slow, grinding erosion, and time, it seemed, was a more patient and thorough master than any Abernathy had ever been. By the late 1890s, the plantation was a ghost of its former self, a skeletal ruin haunted by the memory of its own arrogance. The fields, once a sea of white cotton, now lay fallow, choked with weeds and Johnson grass that swayed in the wind with a dry, rustling sigh. The great house, which had once stood as a proud, white beacon of prosperity, was now a sagging, weary monument to decay. Its paint peeled away in long, curling strips like sunburnt skin, and the shutters, many of them broken, hung at crooked, mournful angles, like eyes half closed in shame. The grand columns were stained with green mildew, and the once manicured gardens had been reclaimed by a riot of untamed nature, honeysuckle and kudzu weaving a thick green shroud over everything. Inside this tomb of a bygone era lived Arthur Abernathy, the grandson of the original master, a man as weathered and burdened as the house he inhabited. He was a weary, haunted man in his late 40s, with his grandfather's sharp features softened by a pervasive melancholy. His hair was prematurely gray at the temples, and his eyes, unlike the flinty, commanding gaze of his ancestor, were filled with a deep, abiding sadness. He lived alone in the vast, echoing house, his footsteps the only sound in the long, dusty corridors, save for one. In the main hall, a silent, imposing presence, the grandfather clock still stood. It was the one object in the house that had been meticulously maintained, its mahogany case still holding a deep, dark luster, a polished coffin in the center of the ruin. For Arthur, it was not a piece of furniture, it was the family curse, the metronome of his family's shame. Every year of his life, on the anniversary of the storm, he had heard it. He had lain in his bed as a child, covers pulled up to his chin, and listened to the 12 resonant chimes, followed by the silent, breathless pause, and then the sharp, impossible crack of the 13th. He had stood before it as a man, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and listened to its defiant temporal rebellion. It was a sound that had defined his life, a yearly reminder of the story that clung to his name like a shroud, the legend of the slave woman who had vanished and the clock that refused to forget her. He felt trapped by it all, a prisoner of his name, his history, and the relentless yearly chiming of a past that would not die. Into this stagnant, forgotten corner of Georgia came a man who represented everything the Abernathy legacy was not. He was a breath of fresh northern air, full of energy and purpose. Alastair Finch was a young historian and folklorist from Boston, a man whose passion lay not in the dry official histories of wars and politicians, but in the stories and beliefs that lived on the lips of the people. He was tall and lean, with an eager, intelligent face and eyes that held a genuine scholarly curiosity. He had come south not to gawk at the ruins of the Confederacy, but to listen. In his research, he had stumbled upon whispers of the 13-chime legend, a story that was too specific, too persistent to be a mere ghost tale. He was determined to investigate, to peel back the layers of myth and find the historical truth he was certain lay at its core. His first stop was the dusty county archives, a small, neglected room in the back of the courthouse. He spent days poring over brittle, yellowed documents, tax records, and property deeds, but he found little more than the cold, hard facts. The Abernathy family owned a long list of names, and among them was Clara Turner, female, aged approx 28. There was no record of her death, No bill of sale, just a name that ceased to appear after 1842. Alistair realized quickly that the true story did not live in ink and paper. It lived in memory, in the oral traditions of the African-American community that had grown up in the shadow of the plantation. He began to spend his afternoons walking the dusty roads, speaking to the elderly men and women who sat on their cabin porches, the children and grandchildren of those who had been enslaved. He was met with caution, with polite but guarded responses. He was another white man asking about the past, and their past was a treasure trove of pain they did not share lightly. But Alistair was patient and, above all, respectful. He did not ask about ghosts. He asked about family stories, about traditions, about the people who had built this land with their hands and their sorrow. His gentle persistence eventually led him to the porch of a woman named Ilara, a matriarch whose grandmother had been a friend of Sarah, the girl who had known Clara. Ilara listened to him for a long time, her eyes cloudy with age but sharp with wisdom, studying his face. "They tell me about a woman who vanished," Alistair said softly, his hat in his hands. "Clara." The old woman looked at him, her expression unreadable. "That's not a story for just anyone," she said, her voice a low, melodic rasp. "Some things are kept for family. Why do you want to know?" Alistair met her gaze directly, his own eyes clear and earnest. "Because I don't think she was just a ghost," he replied, his voice filled with a conviction that surprised even himself. "I think she was a person who did something extraordinary, and her story deserves to be told correctly." Ilara was silent for a long moment, and then she gave a slow, deliberate nod. "The one you need to talk to," she said, "is the one who lives with the ghost. Go to the old house. Talk to the last Abernathy." Following the old woman's advice, Alistair made his way up the long, overgrown drive to the Abernathy house. The place looked even more desolate up close, a magnificent ruin slowly being consumed by time and nature. He felt a historian's thrill mixed with a profound sense of sadness. This was a place where history was not just recorded, it was physically present, a palpable weight in the air. He found Arthur Abernathy on the wide, sagging porch, attempting to repair a broken railing with a set of old, rusty tools. Arthur looked up as Alistair approached, his face immediately clouding over with a look of hostile weariness. He had the haunted, defensive look of a man who had been forced to answer for the sins of his ancestors one too many times. "If you're here about the ghost, you're wasting your time," Arthur said, his voice flat and dismissive, not even bothering with a greeting. He wiped his hands on his trousers and scowled. "There's nothing to see. The house is not for sale, and I'm not interested in telling spooky stories for a nickel." Alistair stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, giving the man his space. He saw the deep-set exhaustion in Arthur's eyes, the defensive posture, and understood that this was a man living under a long siege. "I'm not here about a ghost, Mr. Abernathy," Alistair said, his tone calm and even. He gestured with his head toward the dark, open doorway of the house, from which he could just make out the tall, imposing silhouette of the clock against the dim light of the hall. "I'm here about a woman named Clara Turner. I believe she was a historical figure of great importance, and this clock," he continued, his voice dropping slightly, "is a part of her story. I want to understand it, not exploit it." The use of her full name, spoken with such seriousness, seemed to land with a physical impact. Arthur's scowl faltered, replaced by a look of stunned surprise. No one had ever come here and spoken of Clara Turner as a historical figure. They spoke of the ghost, the legend, the vanishing. But they never gave her the dignity of her own name. Alistair's words had subtly reframed the entire narrative, shifting it from a supernatural curiosity to a matter of historical inquiry, a human story. It was a shift that Arthur, in the lonely, haunted depths of his heart, had been waiting his entire life to hear. The hostility in his eyes did not vanish, but it was joined by a flicker of something new, a reluctant, wary curiosity. He stared at the young man from Boston for a long moment, then let out a slow, weary sigh and gestured with his hammer toward a rickety porch chair. "Tell me what you think you know," he said, the words a grudging invitation into the heart of the mystery. Alistair sat in the rickety chair, the wood groaning under his weight, and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. He looked at Arthur, whose face was a carefully constructed mask of indifference, but whose eyes held the desperate hunger of a man starved for answers. Alistair knew this was a delicate moment, a conversation that could either open a door or slam it shut for another generation. He began to speak, his voice low and steady, laying out the fragments he had gathered, the whispers from the community, the cold, unhelpful facts from the archives, and the persistent, unwavering legend of the 13th chime. But the more he spoke, the more he realized the vastness of what he did not know. His narrative was a skeleton, and he needed someone who had known Clara, someone who had been there to give it flesh and blood. Guided by Alara's parting words, Alistair was eventually led to a small, neat cabin on the very edge of what had once been the Abernathy plantation. It stood in a grove of pecan trees, a plume of white smoke rising from its stone chimney into the crisp autumn air. Here lived Sarah, the oldest living person in the community, the same Sarah who, as a small girl, had watched Clara Turner move through the world like a secret. Alistair found her sitting on her porch in a rocking chair, a colorful quilt spread over her lap despite the mildness of the day. She was impossibly old, her skin a delicate paper-thin map of wrinkles, but her mind, he would soon discover, was as sharp and clear as a shard of glass. He introduced himself, and she listened without a word, her eyes, dark and bright in their deep sockets, studying him with an unnerving intensity. She did not invite him to sit. She simply watched him, testing his intentions, his patience, his spirit. So he stood and he waited. He spoke of his research, of his desire to tell Clara's story not as a ghost tale, but as a history of a brilliant woman's resistance. After what felt like an hour, she finally gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod and gestured with a gnarled hand to a simple wooden stool. As he sat, she began to speak, her voice a soft, rustling whisper like dry leaves skittering across the ground. She told him of Clara, but not the Clara of Abernathy's fear or the legend's fancy. She spoke of a teacher. She described secret lessons held in the quiet moments of dusk or deep in the woods, where Clara taught her not just about herbs for healing, but about the stars, the turning of the seasons, and the very nature of time. She called it walking the crooked path, Sarah whispered, her eyes looking at something far away, a memory as vivid as the present moment. She said the master's world was all straight lines, the rows of cotton, the lash of the whip, the road to the market, all straight. His time was a straight line, too, from the whip to the grave. But she taught me that our time, a free person's time, wasn't a line at all. It was a circle. It touches all points at once, the past, the future, the now. It's the circle of the sun, the turning of the moon. Sarah's frail hand rose and made a slow circle in the air. She said the clock, and her eyes flickered with a deep, ancient understanding. That big clock was the master's line made into a machine, tick-tock, one foot after the other, marching you toward your end. But the storm. Sarah's voice dropped even lower, becoming thick with awe. The storm was her circle. It was power that didn't march, it just was. All at once. She revealed that Clara had been making preparations for months. It wasn't a sudden decision. Sarah remembered gathering specific herbs with her, plants Clara called doorway herbs, and watching her dry them with ritualistic care. She recalled Clara watching the night sky, not with idle curiosity but with the focused intensity of an astronomer, tracking the movement of the stars and whispering to herself about a coming alignment. She wasn't running from something, Sarah said, her voice gaining a surprising strength, a fierce pride that transcended her age and frailty. She was running to something. She was stepping out of his line and into her circle. That's what she did. She found the seam between the ticks of his clock, and she slipped through. Alistair returned to the Abernathy house with Sarah's words echoing in his soul. He was no longer just a historian chasing a story. He felt like a courier, carrying a sacred message across the decades. He found Arthur on the porch again, but this time Arthur was not working. He was simply sitting, staring out at the overgrown fields, the picture of a man waiting. Alistair, his voice now filled with a new and unshakable conviction, explained what he had learned. He spoke of the circle and the line, of the herbs and the stars, of a plan so audacious and brilliant it bordered on the sublime. "I need to look inside the clock, Arthur," Alistair said, his gaze steady. Sarah's testimony, the folklore, it all points to the clock not just being a symbol, but the mechanism itself. I think Clara did something to it. Something hidden. Arthur's reluctance was a palpable thing. That clock was the heart of his family's curse, the source of his lifelong shame. The idea of a stranger, an outsider, laying hands on it, violating its inner sanctum, felt like a profound trespass. But Alistair's certainty was a powerful force, and Arthur's own desperate need for the truth was even stronger. After a long, tense silence, he gave a single curt nod and led Alistair into the dim, cavernous hall. The air inside the house was cool and smelled of dust and decay. But the clock stood as if it were immune to the passage of time, its polished mahogany surface drinking the faint light. With a reverence that surprised them both, they worked together. Arthur, using a key he had not touched in years, unlocked the tall, narrow door in the clock's waist. Alistair, his hands surprisingly steady, reached inside and carefully unhooked the two massive brass-encased weights, their chains rattling softly in the silence. Then came the most delicate part. With Arthur holding a lantern high, Alistair gently worked the pins loose that held the great painted faceplate in place. It came away with a soft sigh of separating wood and metal. He turned it over with the care of an archaeologist handling a priceless artifact. And then he saw it. His breath caught in his throat. On the back of the metal plate, hidden from view for more than half a century, were a series of strange symbols, carefully and precisely carved into the brass. They were not the scratches of a vandal or the tool marks of the clockmaker. They were elegant, intricate, and deliberate, a complex geometric pattern of intersecting lines, circles, bars, and crosses. They were unlike anything European, anything he had ever seen in his study of colonial craftsmanship. But he recognized them. His heart hammered against his ribs. He had seen them in obscure academic texts, diagrams of West African cosmograms, ancient symbols representing the crossroads, the intersection of the physical world and the spiritual realm, the very point where a person could step from one reality into another. It was the crooked path drawn in brass. It was Clara's circle. "My God," Alistair whispered, the words a prayer of pure intellectual awe. This was it. This was the proof. This was not a folk tale. This was not a malfunction. This was the work of a genius, a deliberate, complex, and successful plan. Arthur stared at the symbols, his face pale in the lantern light. The legend he had lived with his whole life, the ghost story that had defined his family, was suddenly terrifyingly real. The abstract shame he had carried had just been given a concrete form, etched into the very heart of his inheritance. He was stunned into a profound, world-altering silence. The sight of those symbols, so alien and yet so purposeful, acted as a key, unlocking something deep within Arthur Abernathy. The passive, weary resignation that had defined his life was burned away by a sudden, desperate need for answers, for his family's side of the truth. Spurred by a compulsion he didn't fully understand, He left Alistair in the hall with the dissected clock and made his way to the one room in the house he had always avoided, the library. It was his grandfather's domain, a dusty, neglected tomb of leather-bound books and forgotten ledgers. The air was thick with the smell of decaying paper and secrets. For hours he searched, pulling down heavy volumes, his hands becoming coated in a fine gray dust. He felt like a trespasser in his own home, disturbing the ghosts that slept there. He found nothing but plantation records and books on agriculture. Finally, in a fit of frustration, he slammed his hand down on the top of his grandfather's massive oak desk. A hollow echo answered the sound. His heart skipped a beat. He ran his hands along the underside of the desktop, his fingers searching until they found a small, almost invisible latch. He pressed it. With a soft click, a false panel in the side of the desk's pedestal sprang open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside lay a single object, a small, leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth with use. With trembling hands, Arthur took the journal to the window, letting the fading afternoon light fall across its pages. The handwriting was his grandfather's, a sharp, aggressive script that seemed to slash at the paper. The early entries were what he expected, arrogant, cruel, detailing crop yields and the punishments meted out for minor infractions. But then Clara's name began to appear, first as a passing note, then with increasing frequency. He read of his grandfather's growing obsession, his fury at her quiet intelligence, which he perceived as a personal affront, a silent rebellion he could not crush. He saw her not as a person, but as a flaw in the perfect order of his world, a puzzle he could not solve and therefore had to break. Then Arthur found the entry for the night of the storm. The neat, controlled script dissolved into a frantic, barely legible scrawl, the ink smudged in places as if by a trembling hand. The 13th chime, his grandfather had written, the words like a scream on the page. It was a sound that unmade the world. It tore a hole in the night. She was there and then she was not. She did not run. She vanished. She looked at me before she went to the clock, a look not of fear but of pity. Pity. For me. She has cursed this house, cursed my name. It was not a storm that took her. It was devilish magic. She has left me here in this broken time, this silent house, and I am terrified of her. I am terrified. Arthur read the words over and over, the confession of his ancestor, the great, powerful Master Abernathy, laid bare in all his pathetic, impotent terror. A profound wave of emotion washed over him, so powerful it made him dizzy. It was not just shame for his grandfather's cruelty, but a shocking, gut-wrenching revelation. The great Abernathy family shame, the story that had haunted him his entire life, was never about a runaway slave. It was about his grandfather's absolute paralyzing fear in the face of a woman whose spirit he could not own, whose mind he could not comprehend, and whose freedom he could not prevent. She had not been his victim. In the end, he had been hers. Alistair's small rented room became a frantic nexus of history, folklore, and science. Papers covered every surface. Sketches of the clock's hidden cosmogram lay next to pages of notes from his conversations with Sarah, and open books on West African spirituality and 19th-century meteorology were stacked precariously on the floor. He worked with a feverish intensity, fueled by coffee and the exhilarating feeling of being on the verge of a monumental discovery. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and brewing coffee, and the only sounds were the scratching of his pen and the occasional murmur as he read a passage aloud. He was cross, referencing everything, weaving together the disparate threads of Clara's story into a single, coherent tapestry. Sarah's words were the key, the Rosetta Stone that translated the entire event. The master's time is a straight line. A free person's time is a circle. He saw it now. The clock was the straight line, a machine designed to impose a rigid, unyielding order on the world. But Clara, with her deep understanding of the crooked path, knew that the world was not made of straight lines. It was made of circles, of cycles, of energies that ebbed and flowed outside the comprehension of men like Abernathy. His notes became a torrent of revelation, a voiceover to the silent movie of his thoughts. He wrote, "The plan was not supernatural. It was scientific, a profound application of natural philosophy that her captors would have dismissed as witchcraft." Clara was not just a mystic, she was a physicist. He sketched the grandfather clock, not as a piece of furniture, but as a scientific instrument. "The massive pendulum and the heavy brass weights," he wrote, his pen flying across the page, "they form a massive grounded metal conductor, a perfect lightning rod." He underlined the word twice. She didn't just wait for any storm. Sarah said she watched the sky for months, tracking the stars. She was waiting for a specific confluence of events, a powerful electrical storm on a date that held astrological or seasonal significance in her own tradition, a night when the veil between worlds or times was at its thinnest. The herbs Sarah had helped her gather were not for a potion, but for focus, for protection, for attuning her own body's energy to the immense power she was about to channel. The symbols carved on the back of the clock face were the final, crucial element. They were her map, her navigation chart for the crooked path. Alistair stood up and paced the small room, his mind alight with the sheer audacity of her genius. The lightning strike was the catalyst. It would have been drawn to the clock, a massive surge of energy overloading the simple mechanical movement. The 13th chime wasn't a chime at all, it was a sonic boom, a temporal fracture, the sound of the straight line breaking. It was a moment outside of time, a seam in reality. In that single chaotic instant, powered by the storm and guided by the symbols, she had done what Sarah said. She had stepped sideways. She had slipped through the crack between the ticks of the master's clock. The final brilliant touch, the detail that filled Alistair with a sense of profound awe, was the hands pointing backward. It wasn't a malfunction. It was a message. It was her final act of defiance, a symbolic and literal reversing of her fate. She was not just escaping, she was unwriting her own bondage, turning back the clock on her servitude. It was not magic in the way of spells and incantations, it was the magic of a profound, holistic understanding of the universe, a knowledge that saw no division between the spiritual and the physical, between faith and physics. Clara Turner had not run away. She had calculated her way to freedom, using her master's ultimate symbol of order as the very instrument of her liberation. With his theory solidified, a coherent and breathtaking narrative of genius and rebellion, Alistair knew he had to return to Sarah. He found her on her porch, rocking gently as if she had been waiting for him. He carried his notebook like a sacred text, and with a humble reverence, he sat on the stool at her feet and laid out his conclusions. He explained the lightning rod, the cosmogram, the temporal fracture, his voice filled with the excitement of his discovery. Sarah listened with a serene, knowing smile on her face, her dark eyes twinkling. She nodded along, not with surprise, but with the quiet satisfaction of a teacher whose student has finally grasped a difficult but essential lesson. When he finished, she simply patted his hand. "You see with a clear eye, son," she whispered. "You listened. Most folks just want to hear the ghost part. You listened for the woman." As they sat in the quiet companionship of shared understanding, a figure appeared, walking slowly up the path to the cabin. It was Arthur Abernathy. He looked different, stripped of the defensive anger that had been his armor. He looked smaller, older, and profoundly humbled. In his hand he clutched his grandfather's journal. He stopped before the porch, his eyes not on Alistair but on the old woman in the rocking chair. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer contain. "May I? I think you have a right to hear this." Sarah gave a slow, regal nod, and Arthur, standing before her like a penitent, opened the journal. He began to read the entry from the night of the storm. His voice at first was hesitant, but it grew steadier as he forced the ugly, terrified words of his ancestor out into the open air. He read of his grandfather's obsession, his fury, and finally his pathetic, abject terror. He did not spare a single damning word. When he read the final line, "I am terrified of her," his voice broke, and a single tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. He closed the book, its purpose finally served. A heavy silence hung in the air, a silence that held the weight of more than 50 years of unspoken truth. Arthur looked at Sarah, his face a portrait of shame and sorrow. "I am so sorry," he whispered, the words a raw, painful confession. "I am so sorry for what my family did." Sarah watched him for a long moment, her ancient eyes holding a deep, sorrowful wisdom. Then she reached out her frail, gnarled hand and gently patted his where it rested on the closed journal. "The past has its own weight, Mr. Arthur," she said, her voice soft but clear. "It's a heavy thing to carry. The important thing is to set it down right." In that moment, something shifted. It was the quiet, profound sound of a wound beginning to heal. The act of confession, offered with true remorse, and the act of forgiveness given with grace, began to dissolve the poison that had seeped into the land for generations. The story of what Alastair had pieced together and what Arthur had confessed began to spread not as a rumor, but as a testimony. The legend of 13, Chime Clara, was transformed. She was no longer a phantom haunting a decaying house. She was an ancestor, a brilliant strategist, a hero whose story was finally being told, and told right. The anniversary of Clara's disappearance was only a few weeks away, and as it approached, the atmosphere in the community began to change. The yearly event, which had always been a source of fearful speculation or quiet, hopeful wonder, now felt different. It felt like a homecoming. The idea began in a conversation on Sarah's porch between Alastair, a humbled Arthur, and Sarah's grandchildren, who were now respected elders in their own right. They would not let the anniversary pass in whispers and shadows. They would gather at the house, not to gawk at a ghost, but to honor the memory of an ancestor. The word spread, and the community responded with a unified sense of purpose. On a bright Saturday morning, a procession of people made their way up the long, overgrown drive to the Abernathy house. They came with scythes and shears and brooms and buckets. They were the descendants of the people who had been forced to build and maintain this place, and now they were returning by their own free will to reclaim it. Arthur stood on the porch, his heart aching with a complex mix of emotions as he watched them arrive. For the first time, he did not feel like a target of their resentment, but a witness to their grace. He had opened the gates, and they had come not with anger, but with a determination to heal. The day was filled with the sounds of work and quiet conversation. Men and women worked side by side, cutting back the kudzu that had strangled the gardens, trimming the wild hedges and sweeping decades of dust and leaves from the wide porches. They worked with a quiet dignity, their movements efficient and purposeful. They were not just cleaning the grounds, they were performing a ritual of purification, washing away the stain of the past with their own communal effort. Arthur, after a moment of hesitation, picked up a pair of shears and joined them, working to clear the tangled rose bushes near the porch. He worked alongside a man whose great-grandfather had been a field hand on this very plantation. They did not speak of the past. They spoke of the weather, of their children, of the best way to prune a rose bush. In that simple shared labor, Arthur felt the heavy cloak of his isolation begin to fall away. He was no longer Arthur Abernathy, the last of a cursed line, the lonely keeper of a haunted house. He was just a man, working with other people to honor the memory of a woman whose story bound them all together. As the sun began to set, the grounds were transformed. The house, though still weathered and worn, no longer looked like a ruin. It looked like a place that was loved, a place that was ready. They were not preparing for a vigil of fear, but for a celebration of freedom, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to find its own way home, even if it had to break the rules of time to do it. The night of the anniversary arrived on a soft, quiet breeze. Unlike all the years before, the sky was not a canvas of bruised purple and angry storm clouds. It was a vast expanse of deep, clear indigo, strewn with a brilliant spray of stars. A gentle quiet settled over the land, a profound peace that felt like a benediction. The grounds of the Abernathy house, so recently reclaimed from the wilderness of neglect, were filled with the soft, flickering glow of 100 candles. People gathered not in fearful huddles, but as a congregation, their faces illuminated in the warm, gentle light. They spoke in low, respectful murmurs, the sound a soft hum of shared history and collective anticipation. They were the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of the people who had known Clara, who had heard the first 13th chime, and who had passed the story down as a sacred text. Tonight they had come to witness the final chapter. Arthur Abernathy stood on the porch not as its guarded keeper but as its humble host. He had thrown open the heavy front doors, and a steady, reverent stream of people flowed in and out of the great hall. They moved with a quiet purpose, their footsteps soft on the polished floorboards. Their destination was the grandfather clock. They stood before it, their faces a mixture of awe, respect, and a deep, ancestral understanding. They were no longer looking at a haunted object, a symbol of their oppression. They were looking at a monument, a testament to the genius of one of their own. They saw the intricate carvings Alistair had revealed, the hidden map to freedom, and they touched the dark, polished wood not with fear but with a sense of familial pride. It was their history, their victory, their clock. Alistair stood near the edge of the porch with Sarah's family, the matriarch's grandchildren, now elders themselves, stood with a quiet, powerful dignity, their presence a living bridge to the past. Alistair felt a profound sense of privilege, a feeling that he was not just an observer of history, but a participant in its making. He watched Arthur move among the people, offering a quiet word here, a nod of welcome there. The man was transformed. The haunted, defensive shell had fallen away, revealing a man finally at peace with his own name, his own home. He was no longer a jailer of a cursed legacy. He was the custodian of a sacred site, a role he now accepted with a humility that was more profound than any pride his ancestors had ever displayed. As the midnight hour drew near, a hush fell over the crowd, both inside the house and out on the lawn. The soft murmur of conversation faded away, replaced by a deep, collective silence. The only sounds were the gentle chirping of crickets and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. The air grew still, charged not with the electric fury of a storm, but with the palpable energy of 100 hearts beating as one, waiting. It was not a moment of fear, it was a moment of profound peace, of sacred anticipation, a culmination of decades of waiting, of wondering, of hoping. They were ready to hear the final chime. Inside the hall, the silence was absolute. The candlelight cast long, dancing shadows, making the familiar room feel like a cathedral. Arthur stood near the clock, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. Alistair and Sarah's descendants stood near the doorway, their eyes fixed on the clock's painted face. The minute hand clicked into place, pointing straight up at the 12. A collective breath was held. Then, the clock began to chime, The sound was as deep and resonant as ever, each note rolling through the hall and out into the night, a familiar, sonorous count. 1, 2, 3. The crowd outside counted along in hushed whispers, their voices a soft chorus of remembrance. 4, 5, 6. The chimes were a roll call of the years, each note a marker of the long, patient wait. 7, 8, 9. Arthur closed his eyes, listening not just with his ears, but with his entire being. 10, 11, 12. The final chime faded, leaving behind a silence that was deeper and more profound than before. The crowd waited, their bodies tense, their senses straining. For a long, heart-stopping moment, it seemed nothing would happen. A quiet sigh of disappointment began to ripple through the people on the lawn. Perhaps the cycle was already broken. Perhaps the story was over. Then it came. The 13th chime. But the sound was utterly transformed. It was not the sharp, violent crack of a breaking world, not the sound of a fissure opening in time. This chime was warm, melodic, a perfectly resolved chord that seemed to sing in the air. It was not a sound of rupture, but of resolution, a note of pure, unadulterated peace that washed over everyone who heard it, soothing the old wounds, calming the ancient fears. It was the sound of a promise fulfilled. As the beautiful, impossible note finally faded, the air in front of the clock began to shimmer, like heat rising from a summer road. The candlelight seemed to bend and warp around a single point in space. Slowly, a form began to coalesce out of the shimmering air. It was the image of a woman. It was Clara. She was not a ghost, not a translucent phantom or a wispy apparition. She was vibrant, solid, and real, as if she had simply stepped out of another room. She was wearing simple, free-flowing clothes of a style no one recognized, and her hair, which had been bound in tight wraps, now flowed freely around her shoulders. Her face, which in memory and imagination had always been a mask of careful composure and hidden strength, was now open, serene, and lit from within by a smile of such profound peace and freedom that it took the breath away. She was home. Her gaze swept over the crowd, her dark, intelligent eyes filled with a loving warmth. She looked at the faces of Sarah's descendants, and her smile deepened with recognition and pride. Her eyes found Arthur, and in her gaze there was no judgment, only a gentle, healing compassion. Finally, her eyes met Alistair's, and she gave him a slow, deliberate nod, a silent acknowledgement of the truth he had so painstakingly uncovered. Then, as gently and peacefully as she had appeared, she began to fade, her form dissolving back into the shimmering air, leaving behind only the scent of old wood, beeswax, and a faint, lingering hint of ozone and starlight. The instant she vanished, a soft, metallic click echoed from within the grandfather clock. Its hands, which had been frozen pointing backward to 11 for more than half a century, trembled for a moment. Then with a smooth, steady grace, they began to move. They swept forward, circling the dial once, twice, a silent, dizzying race through the lost years before finally settling at the correct time, a few minutes past midnight. The clock was healed. The annual chiming was over. The circle was complete. The months that followed were a time of quiet, purposeful change, the final gentle notes of a story that had reached its grand crescendo. The legacy of Clara Turner, no longer a whispered legend but a celebrated history, began to put down new roots in the Georgia soil. Alistair returned to Boston, but his heart and his work remained in the South. A year later, he published his book. It was titled The 13th Chime, Clara Turner and the Chronology of Freedom. It was not a dry academic text. It was a powerful lyrical work of historical reclamation, weaving together folklore, science, and the oral testimonies of the community into a breathtaking narrative of genius and resistance. The book became a sensation, celebrated not just for its scholarship but for its profound humanity. It gave Clara her voice back, transforming her from a footnote in a ledger or a ghost in a folktale into a pivotal figure in the history of American liberation. True to the promise he had made to himself on the night of the vigil, Arthur Abernathy set the past right. He worked with lawyers and community leaders, and with a stroke of a pen he signed away his inheritance. He deeded the Abernathy house, the surrounding land, and the grandfather clock itself to a trust, to be managed by a board composed of Sarah's descendants and other community members. The house of oppression was to be transformed into a place of education and remembrance. It became the Clara Turner Museum and Community Center, a place dedicated to preserving and teaching the region's true history, the stories that had been left out of the official records. The grand rooms that had once echoed with the commands of masters now echoed with the laughter of children learning about their own powerful heritage. The grounds where cotton had been grown through forced labor now hosted community gardens and Juneteenth celebrations. The final narration of Alastair's book, which was inscribed on a simple brass plaque in the museum's main hall, captured the essence of her legacy. It explained that Clara's extraordinary act was not about escaping to a different place, but about creating a different kind of time, a moment of pure possibility that echoed forward, inspiring generations to believe in their own power to break free from the straight lines imposed upon them. Her legend, now grounded in truth, became a testament to the idea that even in the most oppressive and desperate of circumstances, the human spirit, armed with intelligence, courage, and a deep understanding of the world's hidden circles, can find a way to be free. The clock, now just a clock, its steady, quiet ticking a simple measurement of the passing hours, stood in the hall as a silent monument. It was no longer a symbol of a master's rigid order or a family's curse. It was a reminder that true history is not just a straight line of recorded facts, but a rich, complex circle of stories forever touching the past, the present, and the future. The final shot of the documentary made about the book was not of the clock, nor of the house, but of a young girl, one of Sarah's great-great-granddaughters, standing before the clock. She looked up at its tall, silent form, her face not with fear or even awe, but with a quiet, confident smile of understanding and pride. It was her story now,